Hello? This is a speech by Daniel J. Borston, who was the Librarian of Congress in 1975. Before coming to Washington to head the Smithsonian's Museum of Science and Technology in 1969, he taught American history for a quarter of a century at the University of Chicago. In 1967, he was invited to give a talk to the managing editors of the Associated Press. His speech on dissension and their news was delivered on October 13th, 1967 in Chicago. Gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and privilege to be allowed to take part in your meeting. It is especially a pleasure to come and have such a flattering introduction, the most flattering part of which was to be called a person who wrote like a newspaperman. The historians, sometimes try to return that compliment by saying that the best newspapermen write like historians, but I'm not sure how many of the people present would consider that a compliment. This afternoon, I would like to talk briefly about the problems we share, we historians and newspapermen, and all that we share as Americans. About 60 years ago, Mark Twain, who was an expert on such matters, said there are only two forces that carry light to all corners of the globe: the sun in the heaven and the Associated Press. This is, of course, not the only view of your role. Another newspaperman once said it's the duty of a newspaper to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. If there was ever a time when the light and the comfort which you can give us was needed, it's today. And I would like to focus on one problem. It seems to me that dissent is the great problem of America today. It overshadows all others. It's a symptom, an expression, a consequence, and a cause of all others. I say dissent and not disagreement. And it is the distinction between dissent and disagreement which I really want to make. Disagreement produces debate, but dissent produces dissension. Dissent, which comes from the Latin, means originally to feel apart from others. People who disagree have an argument, but people who dissent have a quarrel. People may disagree, but may both count themselves in the majority. But a person who dissents is by definition in a minority. A liberal society thrives on disagreement, but is killed by dissension. Disagreement is the lifeblood of democracy. Dissension is its cancer. A debate is an orderly exploration of a common problem that presupposes that the debaters are worried by the same question. It brings to life new facts and new arguments which make possible a better solution, but dissension means discord. As the dictionary tells us, dissension is marked by a break in friendly relations. It is an expression, not of a common concern, but of hostile feelings, and this distinction is crucial. Disagreement is specific and problematic. Dissent is formless and unfocused. Disagreement is concerned with policy. Dissenters are concerned with identity, which usually means themselves. Disagreeers ask, what about the war in Vietnam? Dissenters ask, what about me? Disagreeers seek solutions to common problems. Dissenters seek power for themselves. The spirit of dissent stalks our land. It seeks the dignity and privilege of disagreement, but it is entitled to neither. All over the country, on more and more subjects, we hear more and more people quarreling and fewer people debating. How has this happened? What can and should we do about it? This is my question this afternoon. In the first place, I would like to remind you of one feature of the situation which suggests it may not be as desperate as it seems. This is what I would call the law of the conspicuousness of dissent, which is another way of saying there never is quite as much dissent as there seems. I will start from an oddity of the historical record, which other American historians can confirm for you. When we try to learn, for example, about the history of religion in the United States, we find that what is generally described as that subject is a history of religious controversies. It is very easy to learn about the halfway covenant problem, the Great Awakening, the Unitarian controversies, the Americanist controversies, and so on. But if we want to learn about the current of daily belief of Americans in the past, it's very difficult. And this is the parable of the problem of history. If we want to learn about the history of divorce, there are many excellent histories of divorce. But if we want to learn about the history of marriage, we'll find there are practically none. Similarly, if we want to learn about eating and drinking habits, there are some excellent histories of vegetarianism and food fads, some first-rate histories of prohibition, but almost no good histories of eating and drinking. Why is this the case? It is simply because of what I would call the law of the conspicuousness of dissent. Controversies, quarrels, disagreements leave a historical debris of printed matter, not to mention broken heads and broken reputations. Carrie Nation smashing up a bar makes much more interesting reading and is more likely to enter the record in the peaceable activity of the bartender mixing drinks. But this may lead us to a perverse emphasis. How have people lived and thought and felt and eaten and drunk and married in the past? Interests are focused on the cataracts, the eddies, the waterfalls and whirlpools, but what of the stream? This is a natural bias of the record, and it equally affects the reporting of news. It is obvious that a sermon is less newsworthy than a debate, and a debate still less newsworthy than a riot. This is all obvious, but it has serious consequences for the condition of our country today. The natural bias of the record tends to lead us to emphasize and inevitably overemphasize the extent of dissent. Secondly, the rise and manipulation of media. The profession, which you gentlemen represent, together with the American standard of living, leads us also towards the exaggeration of the importance of dissent in our society. Since dissent is more dramatic and newsworthy than agreement, media inevitably multiply and emphasize dissent. It is an easier job to make a news story of men who are fighting with one another than it is to describe their peaceful living together. All this has been reinforced by certain obvious developments in the history of the newspaper and the other media within the last half-century or so, the increasingly frequent and repetitious news reporting. The movement from the weekly newspaper to the daily newspaper to several editions a day, the rise of radio reporting of news every hour on the hour, with news breaks in between, all require that there be changes to reports. There are increasingly voluminous spaces, both of time and of print, which have to be filled. And all these reports become more and more inescapable from the attention of the average citizen. In the bar, on the beach, in the automobile, the transistor radio reminds us of the headaches of our society. Moreover, The increasing vividness of reports also tempts us to depict objects and people in motion, changing, disputing. The opportunity to show people in motion, and to show them vividly, had its beginning, of course, in the rise of photography and Matthew Brady's pioneer work in the Civil War, and then, more recently, with the growth of the motion picture and television. All this tempts us to get a dramatic shot of a policeman striking a rioter or vice versa. We now have tape recorders in the scene in which people can express their complaints about anything. Moreover, the rise of opinion is a new category. The growth of opinion polling has led to the very concept of opinion as something people can learn about. There was a time when information about the world was divided into the category of fact or the category of ideas. But more recently, especially with the growth of market research in this century, people now must have opinions. They are led to believe by the publication of opinion polls that their opinion, whether it be on the subject of miniskirts or marijuana or foreign policy, is something that separates them from others. Moreover, if they have no opinion, even that now puts them in a dissenting category. Then there's the rise of what I call secondary news. News about the news. With an increasingly sophisticated readership and more media, we have such questions as whether a news conference will be cancelled. Will someone refuse to make a statement? Is the fact that Jackie Kennedy denied there was a supposed engagement between her and Lord Harlech itself a kind of admission? What is really news? Moreover, the very character of American history has accentuated our tendency to dissent. We are an immigrant society. We are made up of many different groups who came here and who felt separate from one another, who were separated not so much by doctrine or belief as by the minutiae of daily life, by language, religious practices, cuisine, and even manners. Until the 1930s and 1940s, the predominant aim of those who were most concerned in this country with the problem of immigration was to restrict immigration or to assimilate those immigrants who were admitted, to Americanize the immigrant. This was the motto of those who were most concerned with this question. But in the last few decades, we've had a movement from assimilation to integration, and this is an important distinction. In about the 1930s, Louis Adamick began writing, and, in his book A Nation of Nations in 1945, he began an emphasis which has often been repeated. It was no longer the right of the immigrant to be Americanized, to be assimilated. It was now the right of the immigrant to remain different. The ideal ceased to be that of fitting into the total society, and instead became the right to retain your differences. Symptoms of this were such phenomena in politics as the rise of the balanced ticket which consists of outspoken and obvious representatives of different minorities. It brought with it the assumption that the only 100% American is the person who is only partly American. It led General Eisenhower to make something of his German name and his German background, which had not occurred to very many of us before. It encouraged John F. Kennedy to exploit his Irish background, the notion being that one was more fully American by being partly something else. This sense of separateness and the power of minorities developed alongside two great movements. One in the social sciences. The growth of literature, much of which stems from universities in this area, and especially from the University of Chicago. A literature of the social sciences which came to show minorities who they were, and where their power might be. Gunnar Myrdal's book American Dilemma, which was quoted by the Supreme Court integration decision of 1954, was a very good illustration of this. The rise of opinion polling also led into this. People in small groups were reminded that they had a power and a locale which they had not known before. Stokely Carmichael himself has referred to this on several occasions, that he may represent a group which is not very numerous, but he knows where they are. They're in crucial places where they can exercise power. Alongside this change in our thinking and this extension of our knowledge came a change in technology which I would call the rise of flow technology. Minimum speed 40 miles an hour. This means that while formerly, in order to do damage to other people, it was necessary for you to set things in motion, to wave your arms or wield a club. Now, when the economy and the technology are in motion, if you want to cause damage, you need to only stop and the other people do the damage. This is a parable which was illustrated in the blackout in New York, the stall-ins and sit-ins. At a time when certain students seized the administration building at a neighboring university last year, all they had to do was hold that one building. All the salary checks flowed through the IBM machines in that building, and they were able to throw a monkey wrench into the machinery. This has the effect of developing what I would call a minority veto psychology. Small groups have more power than ever before. In small numbers, there is strength. This results in the quest for minority identity. Whereas formerly, people used to change their names to sound more American, to try to fit into the background, now the contrary seems to be occurring. And we find symptoms of this in the intellectual world. Perhaps that is a misnomer. I should say, rather, in the world of those who consider themselves or call themselves intellectuals. I find in this world today, in this country, a growing belief in the intrinsic virtue of dissent. It's worth noting that some of the greatest American champions of the right to disagree and to express disagreement, Thomas Jefferson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. William James, John Dewey, and others, were also great believers in the duty of the community to be peacefully governed by the believers, by the will of the majority. But more recently, dissent itself has been made into a virtue. Dissent for dissent's sake. We have a whole group of magazines these days dedicated not to this or that particular program or social reform, nor this or that social philosophy, but simply to dissent. Professional dissenters do not and cannot seek to assimilate their program or ideals into American culture. Their main object is to preserve their separate identity as a dissenting minority. They're not interested in the freedom of anybody else. The motto of this group might be an emendation of the old maxim of Voltaire, which I'm sure you've all heard. But nowadays, people would say, "I do not agree with a word you say, and I will defend to the death my right to say so." Once upon a time, our intellectuals competed for their claim to be spokesmen of the community. Now, the time has almost arrived when the easiest way to insult an intellectual is to tell him that you, or most other people, agree with him. The way to menace him is to put him in the majority. For the majority must run things and must have a program, and dissent needs no program. Dissent, then, has tended to become the conformity of our most educated classes. In many circles, to be an outspoken conformist, that is, to say that the prevailing ways of the community are not evil, requires more courage than to run with the dissenting pack. The conformity of nonconformity, the conformity of dissent, produces little that is faithful in its conclusions and very little effective discussion or internal debate, for the simple reason that it does not involve anybody in attacking or defending any program. Programs, after all, are the signs of the establishment. The situation that I have described leads to certain temptations which afflict the historian as well as the newsman. And among these temptations, I would like to include the tendency to stimulate and accentuate dissent rather than disagreement. To push disagreement toward dissent so that we can have a more dramatic or reportable event. To push the statement of a program towards the expression of a feeling of separateness or isolation. There is an increasing tendency, also, to confuse disagreement with dissent. For example, the homosexuals in our society, who are a group who feels separate, and from one point of view, a classic example of what we mean by the dissenter, now articulate their views in declarations and statements. Nowadays, they become disagreeers. They have formed Matachine societies. They issue programs and declarations. This, I would say, is good. But on the other hand, we find dissenters who are increasingly tempted to use the techniques of dissent. We find disagreeers who are increasingly tempted to use the techniques of dissent. Students who disagree about the war in Vietnam use the techniques of dissent, of affirming their secession from society, and this is bad. The expressions of disagreement may lead to better policy, but dissent cannot. The affirmation of differentness and feeling apart cannot hold a society together. In fact, these tend to destroy the institutions which make fertile disagreement possible and fertile institutions decent. A sniper's bullet is an eloquent expression of dissent, a feeling apart. It doesn't express disagreement. It is formless, inarticulate, unproductive. A society of disagreeers is a free and fertile and productive society. A society of dissenters is a chaos leading only to dissension. Now, I would like, in conclusion, to suggest that we are led to a paradox which must be solved. A free and literate society, with a high standard of living and increasingly varied media, one that reaches more and more people more and more of the time, such a society finds it always easier to dramatize its dissent rather than disagreement. It finds it harder and harder to discover, much less to dramatize its agreement on anything. This ends, then, some questions which I will propose to you gentlemen, to which I hope you may have answers. At least they seem to me to be crucial ones. First, is it possible to produce interesting newspapers that will sell, but which do not dramatize or capitalize or catalyze dissent and dissension, the feeling of apartness in the community? Is it possible to produce interesting newspapers that will sell, but which do not yield to the temptation to create and nourish new dissent by stirring people to feel apart in new ways? Second, is it possible at the same time to find new ways of interesting people in disagreement in specific items and problems and programs and specific evils? Finally, is it possible for our newspapers, without becoming Pollyannas or chauvinists or super patriots or good humor salesmen, to find new ways of expressing and affirming, dramatizing and illuminating what people agree upon? This is your challenge. The future of American society, in no small measure, depends on whether and how you answer it. Okay. So he makes this distinction between disagreement and dissent. Disagreement, I think, is, as I'm seeing it here, the sort of classical, I have an opinion, this is why I have an opinion, let's get into an agreement about which is the best way forward. Right? I disagree with what the administration is doing. I disagree with the attitude of the church. I disagree with the opinion of the learned senator. I disagree with the statement of the government. I disagree with the opinion of the policeman. I disagree with the words of the radical. I disagree with the idea that hope is dead, right? And you can talk, I think we all recognize this, right? When you can talk with someone and you can have a discussion, we may still end up at, I feel this and you feel that. I think that isn't important, you think that is important, and so on and so on. Fill in whatever issue you're talking about, racism, sexism, the economy, the jobs, whether tariffs are good or bad, how taxes should work, what the future of the country is going to bring, how troublesome is this cultural problem you're thinking about, how important is it that the states work something out before the Supreme Court. Does the Supreme Court need to step in? Is the government reaching farther than it should? Is the government not doing enough? And you may end up leaving the discussion going, okay, I guess we can agree to disagree, right? And you may end up leaving the discussion saying, I just don't get the other person. Or you may end up leaving the discussion going, this person is just like full of hate, or maybe this person is like naive and doesn't understand, history or philosophy or the way the country is going, or so on and so on. And that is for him the difference between discussion and dissent in topics. But also, he's trying to talk about a way of life, like the manner in which we think of ourselves. And it's interesting to read. So he begins talking about something like, well, these people in the universities who are protesting against Vietnam, and these people who are religious, whatnot, and all these time periods, and these immigrants, especially for him, are claiming they have a right to be separate. And then that is for him an expression of dissent, in that now you take pride in your separateness. And I think we've all seen this happen to one extent or another in, well, people we know, for me, and at the very least people you see on TV, where you watch them or you hear them and you go, this person just doesn't like America, or this person just doesn't like the way things are, and they want to burn it all down, start again. This person wants to come to our country and yet keep up the views of the old country, or this person wants to hold on to their views from the 60s or the 70s, or this person is standing in the way of progress, or this person just doesn't understand on the issues that are going on, or this person holds some very strange views, or was this person born in a cult? Is this person illiterate? This person has been brainwashed. This person has no real understanding of what they're asking. This person obviously doesn't have, a kid, a job, or on the other side, hasn't been attacked for their sexuality, or doesn't really understand what it's like to be me, and they're blind to the problems of the country, and they're insisting everything is fine, but really it isn't. And so I'm dissenting, and I'm like, how do you get to that point, right? It's really about when you are different, how do you uphold that difference without making it a barrier between you and the rest of the people? And he points out something interesting to me here. He says that a The ideal ceased to be that of fitting into the total society, and instead became the right to retain your differences. Okay? People in small groups were reminded that they had a power in a locale which they had not known before. He said, this has the effect of developing what I would call a minority veto psychology. Small groups have more power than ever before. The small numbers are in strength. This results in the quest for minority identity. Okay, and I think that's important. This results in the quest for minority identity. So if you go back to like the book on racism I was talking about earlier, black and white. Okay, think of it this way: the more you end up fighting with your enemy or struggling against a force, the more two forces end up struggling against each other, the more they become alike. So if you begin as blacks on bottom, right? You come out of the Civil War, you have all these issues, and the entire nation, the entire power of the nation, dislikes you, doesn't like your culture. Your culture isn't accepted. Your skin color isn't positive. You aren't eligible for this job or that job or that job. You don't see people who look like you or talk like you or think like you, writing newspaper articles or later on the TV or on the radio. You don't hear music that is your kind of music. Even if you do, it's in your areas only, or you go and you sing your Negro music, as they would have said it in like the 1920s, in some dance hall, but you got to go in the back door, right? And you can't. Like, there was a movie about some pianist and a year or so ago, and it goes down south, and he can't eat in the restaurants where he's playing the piano, sort of bit. So what do? Well, you end up doing something like Harlem, right? At least as I understand, you end up with, if my culture and my identity is bad, then you have two options, right? You can either accept the judgment. You can say, yeah, all my blackness is bad. I better be white. Or you can say, I have pride in my own identity, in my own history, in my own people, and music and philosophy and vision and friendships and the struggle and whatnot. And so you respond by seeing yourself as the minority identity, and you can gain strength from that, right? Because this is essentially American. I mean, America is the minority, right? It is the 13 colonies rebelling against the Empire of Great Britain. It is the small group of people who managed to become the greatest nation on earth. Right? Americans don't see themselves as the. Oh, okay. The story of America is we're some small little scrappy fighters, and we beat all of them. Every person who raises their fist against them, we've never lost a war. And we're a small nation. We aren't Europe. We aren't these colonial empires. But by golly, we have a good right fist. Sort of bit. There was no chance that nobody thought that America could win against great American colonies, could win against Great Britain. That was not entertaining. Nobody thought that America could beat the French, the Mexican, the Spanish, the Germans. I mean, as you go farther and farther up the timeline, it seems more and more likely. You're like, okay, yeah, the Americans could beat up the Spanish. Okay, yeah, I can see how they could beat up the Mexicans, and I can see how they could beat up the Germans and the Japanese, and the Iraqis and whatnot. But the first war, the first fight, is still there in the mindset. We are the scrappy little 13 colonies freeing ourselves from Great Britain, and here's the story of George Washington starving in Valley Forge. Yeah, So what happened? You begin to take. So go back to like the 1920s or so, and well before that, it's just the point in time which I'm most aware of. Right? 1910s, 1940s, 1890s, somewhere around there. You know, you have this movement that begins to take pride in an identity, and this identity binds people together. What it does, it acts as a force on a community, so that the dissenters are less. You have a pressure on dissenters to be part of the community. It is massively helped, of course, by the existence of discrimination and racism against Black people in the United States. So you have an outside force pushing them as well. But you can see this in other movements like Israel, right? The story, the mentality of Israel is a small, tiny country fighting against those who are 100 times its size, and Iran is 15 times our population, but we can still beat them and whatnot. And we're surviving by the skin of our teeth. You have that story. You have other examples. Pick any small country from Georgia to Rwanda, right? From Cuba to the Philippines. We aren't the mightiest country on the planet, but we get by. And we take pride in this, and this is how we become a people. And we've been assaulted and attacked. Armenia, for example, right? There's this idea when we went through the genocide in Turkey, and then we have the troubles with Azerbaijan, and we're pushed between Turkey and Azerbaijan, and then Russia's kind of not really a friend, and Iran is a complicated relationship, and Georgia isn't much of anything. And we're just, trying to survive here, and there's all this pride in the identity that you take care of. So what happens if you are the majority? When you are comfortable as the majority, when you don't feel threatened, when you're like, whiteness is good and fine in the United States of America. When you think, the Western way of life, the Western European philosophy, and the American free trade market is just fine, it's working, and there's no trouble. And there's people who dissent, but they don't really matter until they do, right? Until one day you lose a war, until your market starts to show some cracks, until there are protests in the streets about your decisions. Until you can't quite get all of your policies through, until the political process starts to have a problem, and until their news stories pop up about all this dissent and these people who don't like you, or these people who don't understand you, who don't accept you, and they're trying to tell you what to do. And now, what happens to a majority when it feels threatened? It sees itself as under threat, and it does one of two things, right? It either accepts that it is now a more complicated world, and you have to negotiate with people and find a compromise. This is harder when dealing with dissent, right? Because you have people going up and saying, I am depending on the time period, right? Everything from I'm Catholic and I'm Protestant to I am, for this Islamic ruler against that Islamic ruler. I am for, the emperor or the shogun. I am for, let's say, the blacks or the whites. I am for free trade or controlled trade. I am for America or China. I am for communism or capitalism, and so on and so on. And what I think the majority can tend to hear is dissent. Is the majority is bad. The majority is wrong. The majority doesn't respect me. The majority is trying to attack me. And when you hear all this stories about, I guess because I'm whatever I am, Because I'm Turkish, Azerbaijani, I'm trying to attack the Armenians. Because I'm white, I'm trying to attack the blacks. Because I don't know, I'm from Ireland, I'm trying to attack the English. And these are the stories you hear, the news bits, and it seeps into your head, into your mind. I'm the South is trying to attack the North. The North is trying to attack the South. That'll story. And so as a majority, you feel threatened and attacked. So instead of trying to enter discussion, what you do is become dissenters, right? You say, oh, I must push back. I must stop these people who are doing these bad things or who are disagreeing with my culture and my history and my interpretation of events. Because they aren't willing to compromise and so on. Now, there may be good reasons why they don't appear willing to compromise, right? When it comes to an issue of like slavery in the United States, yeah, there's not much to compromise over. Either slavery is illegal or not illegal. There's a very moral stance here. When it comes to Scotland and England and Ireland, who should rule where? Do you have a right to the throne? Is this held legally? Is it being abused? Who is actually supposed to be in charge, or is the government of whatever area upholding its duties? Every colonial problem in the world is like this at one point or another, right? We need to rule ourselves, and we don't like how the Europeans are doing it, sort of bit. Or we don't. Maybe it could even be we don't have that many problems with the Europeans, but we'd still like to rule ourselves. Or we want a increased home rule, a la Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and whatnot. Okay, but what I'm trying to get at is there are other times where you can have a discussion, right? There are other times, like in the United States, for example, you have something like abortion, right? And you have one group who says we should all be abortion should be allowed 100%. You have another group who says abortion should never be allowed, never 100%. You have another group who says something like, well, abortion should be allowed in these certain circumstances, but not these other circumstances. And you have another group which says something like, abortion should be decided state by state rules and not. But you have another point saying that abortion should not be state by state because that means that people have different rights in different states, and this is an abortion is a extremely important issue, and whatnot and whatnot. Like I was told long ago that one of the reasons abortion became a big issue is that if you were rich, you could just fly out of country and have it done in Europe anyway. So it's not an issue that actually affects this time, whenever the time period was, right? That the rich upper class was only a poor class issue, which made the whole story more complicated. And when I say, oh, there's all these different ideas, this plan, this person thinks these things, and there's this group and that group and the other group, I think I do something which is kind of rare, right? I'm saying, okay, all these groups have ideas, and maybe there's a way to discuss with people back and forth. For this, or I'm for this, I'm against this. I like this idea, I don't like this idea. Well, I understand why you feel that way, but I think that you don't. But I think that the results will not end up the way you think, the way it turns out. Or I understand why you feel that way, but I think that is not politically viable right now for such so and so a reason, right? And I think you have to change things. And I admit I can be wrong. I've changed my mind about plenty of things before, and I will in the future. And this to me is an expression of disagreement, right? People disagree about this issue. A dissent, though, is when I say, okay, people have all these different views, and one of those groups, some person who believes one of these things comes up and says, "Oh, I believe this, and I am right, and everybody else is wrong, and there's no discussion to be had." The Bible says this, or these are our human rights, flat out. And it's like, okay, yeah, I get it, but where do we go from here? You end up in just sort of a knockdown, drag out fist fight, right? How do you move from I have my identity as someone who is trans or gay or straight or all one of the other, or questioning one of the other colors and ideas, and I have certain rights, or I should have certain rights that I don't have, or I should be treated in certain ways that I'm not treated, and then there's a group that disagrees with you, right? Go back to the black and white bit. When you're black and you're treated a certain way, and you say, I should not be treated in this way, this is not right. How do you manage dissent versus disagreement, right? And I think, to me, it is in the manner of speech. It is in the possibility for gradual movement and not just sudden movement. It is in the possibility of understanding how a small part of the system can change without breaking the rest of the system. As we go back to the bit where if you're black, then you're minority, and then eventually you have two choices where you say black is wrong and I want to be white, right? I like you straighten your hair, you whiten your skin, you learn how to speak in the quote unquote proper way. You wear makeup which is dull. You don't wear blue eyeshadow and stuff like that. You don't braid your hair. You dance demurely. These are like, I don't know, 1920s, 1950s. Or even just something as simple as sexism, where I don't raise I'm a woman, so I don't raise my voice because I'll always be seen as bad if I do so. I'll always be seen as a disagreement, or if I'm a big black man, I don't raise my voice because people are always going to see me as dangerous if I do so. And this is holding yourself back. This is saying some part of my identity is not acceptable, and this can be in modern ages, like the trans issue is something, but also your religion can be something, which is an issue. Like if you're super religious, it can be awkward to come out and say, "Oh, I am very honestly religious," and praise God in every third sentence. Depending on where you are, people might look at you kind of weird. Same as you're like proudly atheist. I'm like, and you have atheist stickers all over your car. People in certain areas might look at you kind of weird. It's like, why are you standing? Like, why is this so important to you? And so you end up with, okay, so back to like Black history, and then you end up having this minority identity which identifies itself, and then there is this view of Blackness which becomes entrenched inside the minds of the community, and these social norms or social expectations are enforced by both inside and outside movements. You try to be just a regular person, and then someone calls you the N-word, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, you realize that society sees you in a certain way. Or you try to say something, and then someone says to you, oh, you said an insensitive racial statement, and you go, oh, I didn't even, okay, I guess I said something wrong. Right? And you all of a sudden you realize, oh, other people see the world different than me, and you feel like, what do you do, right? If you're the majority, what do you do when you realize other people see the world different than me, and they want it to be different? And they see themselves as different because they recognize that they are different, and that I myself am assisting in this. In certain areas, I might look at you weird. Why are you looking at them weird, right? Why is it that like if you're darker skinned wearing a nice car and you're in an upper class neighborhood, you're more likely to get stopped. Why do you feel more nervous when a cop pulls you off by the side of the road? If you're white, then there are certain words you can't say or certain ideas you have to be very careful to enunciate about. And you're like, okay, I guess that isn't part of the social norm or the social reputation. And if I say something, then even if people don't look at me weird, I expect that they will look at me weird. And these identities, and you can either kind of accept their point of view, and quiet down, or you can take pride in your own that super self-identity, right? You can be not just gay, but like super gay, right? Like blatantly out there, like, okay, man, calm down a little bit. Not everything has to be a sexual joke or something like this, sort of gay. And you can also do this in religious terms. Look, you don't have to dress like it's the 1850s every year, every day. You don't have to become so. I've been in classes like this where you have a philosophy discussion, and then somebody pops up and says, well, the Bible doesn't say that. And I'm like, okay, it's one thing to say that, and I understand, but sometimes people become, very offended or very distressed when encountering different ideas, encountering different ways of looking at the world. So sometimes I hear, someone pop up in a philosophy class and say, well, the Bible says this, or God says this, and I hunch down, prepare. I'm like, okay, is this going to be someone who can have a discussion or someone who cannot have a discussion? Right? Is this going to be someone where you can interact with them, or something where they have their identity and their pride and their focus, and that's it, right? I mean, you can look again. You can look at racism, and you have the white men, some white guy saying, the blacks don't know what they're talking about. Some white guy saying, I wouldn't trust a white man in any way whatsoever. You can look at culturalism, I suppose. I don't trust the Poles. I don't trust the Irish. I don't trust the Scottish. I don't trust these new weird people coming through with the headscarves and whatnot. I don't really. I can't. I mean, I've seen this happen with an old folk I know. Like, someone comes up and it's like a waiter from India, and he's talking, and like old guy's looking there going like, and turns to me and says, I didn't understand a word he said, right? Like the other option is old person gets annoyed. Speak proper English. You're an American, darn it. Why don't you speak English? Why are you only speaking Spanish? Or why are you speaking Hindi? And why do you have such an accent? And people can get very distressed by that. So it's difficult to articulate, right? The difference between dissent and disagreement, but I think we recognize it when we see it. You talk with someone about a religion or a personal issue or a political issue, and you sort of feel out how emotionally engaged they are in this, like how hard is the and reactive is their identity. And if you find it's a sort of flowable identity, if you find that there are things you have in common, that there are discussions you can end up in, there are disagreements you can have, but then you agree on other things and whatnot, then you grow to feel more comfortable with this person or this culture, right? I've been in foreign cultures where I go and I'm like, I don't understand the context of this conversation, or okay, something something here in this social situation has become very awkward and I don't know what it is. So do I just back away, or do I ask straight up, okay, you seem upset. Did I say anything? Like did I miss something? What's going on here? It requires a sort of courage as well to do that, because you don't always know if you say something controversial. or if you say something mainstream, even, someone might turn and look at you and go, "That's crazy," or "You're an idiot. You don't know what we're talking about," right? You could come up and say that, capitalism is the devil. And there's people who will look at you and like you're crazy, like you don't know what you're talking about. You could come up and say communism is the devil. People look at you like you're crazy. You don't know what we're talking about. Capitalism is obviously the devil, the devil, the bad thing. No matter what version or view you have, someone disagrees with you. But do they dissent with you? Right? Do they think that you have no idea what you're talking about? And so we go back to the minority-majority bit. Right? So you're playing black, and you have your own identity, and you form a history which becomes important, and people in the community know this, and they recognize the social issues, and you have stories of medical experiments that result in a mistrust of doctors among the population. You have certain types of music which come up, and people take pride in that. And all of a sudden, you like you see this, like why do all the black boys listen to rap, right? And I think today it's much more common for rap to be all over the place, but there was certainly a period in my childhood where you're like, okay, the black guys listen to like rap and hip hop, but nobody else does. So what happened here? Well, it's a matter of identity. Identity with people that look like me or sound like me or talk like me, or this is the music that is popular among my friends, and it, like the mechanism of that is not clearly understood and whatnot. So you go back to something like country music, like redneck country music. I got a pickup truck. Same thing. I was talking a few days ago about the book on taxes I was reading, where the guy had a view of the Civil War which I tend to disagree with, right? And he's like, well, it was taxes and money, and it wasn't about slavery and all. And that's the story, that's the idea, that's the identity that reinforces itself. But can you have a discussion about that, right? How solid is that identity? How reactive is distress? So I think what the author is getting at here is that we have hard under identities, and that because of that, something interesting has happened. The identity is a minority identity. We don't see ourselves as the Americans so much as the Americans who are against fascism, the Americans who are against the leftist culture wars, the Americans who are against bigots, the Americans who are against sexual deviance, the Americans who are against late-stage capitalism, the Americans who are against the communists and the socialists. And each of these identities is a minority identity, is a I am being attacked identity, is a I am not the mainstream identity, is a I have to take pride in my identity because my identity distinguishes me from the majority. And so you claw closer and closer. You cling more and more to that identity because it becomes a rock, a foundation, a solid pillar, holding apart the earth and sky for you. This fact that I am black, or I am white, or I am a Republican, or I am a Democrat, or I am I am straight, or I am bi, or I am for this system, or I am against that system, or I'm religious, or I am anti-religious, or I am going to be on the side that is in control, or I'm going to be on the side that protects the country or saves the country, or from these people or for these people. And there's always somebody out there saying, I believe this and I am for this, and I am the minority, obviously, because I don't run the country. So I think what can happen is the majority ends up seeing that a minority is using a technique to gain power, is using a technique to limit dissension, is using a technique to focus its energies. And the majority says, oh, I better try doing that too. So the majority starts to do what a minority does, and the majority starts to see itself as a minority under persecution. You start to see enemies everywhere. You start to see troubles in every direction. And all of a sudden you have something which I think is, to reference contemporary American politics, really kind of strange to folk who are like me, that live on the, slightly left in a multicultural area, and who are, lighter skinned and have relatively comfortable lives. And we go like, what's all the hubbub, right? You hear about school shootings, and there's people who are like, but gun rights are so important. And I'm going, I don't fire guns all the time, like my brother does, some of my friends do, but it's not really important to me. And they like, why are they so rabid? Why are people so rabid about this idea? Or you hear about a black kid getting shot by the cops, and you're going, well, okay, yeah, that sucks. And I personally haven't seen a black kid gotten shot by the cops. How often does this happen? And you're relying on news articles, right? You hear about one black kid getting shot by the cops, and you don't think anything of it. You hear 1 and 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 and 15, and for 15 years, you hear dozens and hundreds of these. Or you talk to someone who mentions it, and they're all involved in it, and all of a sudden you start to think, oh, maybe this is a problem. You see the world in a new way. But there are folk out there who, even though they hold all the power and the view, see themselves as under threat, see themselves as a minority. Part of the reason that people voted for Donald Trump in the last election, as I understand it, is because they felt that he was not a politician. Right? They felt that he was like them, and they felt that he was, he's exactly what he says he is. Like, he's not hiding much. And so they appreciated that. Or like there's other groups who had voted for him just because he wasn't a Democrat, but or just because he was for border control, and he blamed the problems of the nation on what they thought the problems of the nation should be blamed on, minorities essentially, of one sort or another, whether it be in their orientation or their illegality or their political views or whatnot. And that happened because Donald Trump embraced a minority identity, right? He said, essentially, look at what all these leftists want to do to the country. Look at how much power they have. Look how they're changing things. Here's a story of some illegal drug problem, gangster issue, and we'll bring it up again and again and again. And it's obviously important and huge issue. Here is a story about transgender people in sports and women's sports, and you got to be protecting your woman folk and whatnot. And I go on and I'm like, okay, you're talking about like an extremely low number of high school level athletes, in this particular story that's brought up, and I go, that doesn't seem super dangerous. But what is it presented as by someone like Donald Trump, by that right wing side, as this huge issue that the nation is under attack, right? And all of a sudden, you bind people together. You end up having a sort of cultish view around like Donald Trump. where he can't do any wrong, and it's not because people actually think he can't do wrong. It's because now criticizing him becomes an issue in itself. Because you have this idea, this minority dissent idea, which says we are special and we are unique and we are small and we are threatened, and if you aren't for us, you're against us. I think that's essentially the difference between this discussion and dissent. If I disagree with you in a discussion, we agree to disagree. We'll vote on it. We'll do what we can to work this out, and we can find a compromise somewhere. But if we dissent, then if you disagree with me in any way, you're obviously my enemy, right? You're obviously not for me. Then this can pop up in any issue whatsoever, anywhere, right? You want to criticize black or white. You want to criticize, illegal or illegal. You want to criticize immigration. You want to criticize religion. You want to criticize a war from Armenia and Azerbaijan to Israel and Palestine, to Ukraine and Russia, to the drug issues going on in South America, to America versus the Venezuela. Seems like it might pop up any day. And there is someone who says, you aren't for us. If you aren't for us, you're against us. If you don't support LGBTQ plus rights in every conceivable way, to the absolute maximum, then you must hate everyone who is LGBTQ plus. Right? Or if you are in any way for transgender people, then you must be anti-American, and you have to also hate white folk, and you must want to, destroy our sacred traditions and tell us what to do, and you're probably for big government, and all of a sudden the enemy is the majority. Because what a minority can do, I think, or what a minority viewpoint can do is say, we are small. We are not the majority. But what do you do if you are the majority, right? What do you do if as a majority, or as at least some group with very, very substantial political, economic, and cultural power, you still feel that you are a minority? How do you justify that? How could you possibly say that white folk are 85% of the wealth of the country, and we're being attacked, and we have to have a viewpoint which is pro-dissent, where anyone attacking us or anyone disagreeing with the main idea of this figure or with this political party, must be demonized and cast out and treated as the bad person? How do you do that when you have 85% of the wealth, or 85% of the political vote, or you control 50% or 45%? You have governorships and both houses of multiple states and all this. How do you justify it? I think what you do is you take every minority and you start to put them all together. I think you start to look at everyone who is against you and you say, they are the majority. They must be the majority because there's so many of them. So all you need is a very small number of minorities to exist, right? They don't have to be minority identities. They don't have to be anything of that sort. All you have to do is say, hey, look at these people and 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 these people, and they all dislike us. And you paint them all with a broad brush because they are against you in certain ways, but different ways. This group A doesn't like something you do, and group B doesn't like something else you do, but they're fine with the thing that group A dislikes. And this continues through, C, D, E, J, K, F, K, Z, 92. or whatnot. And when you have, the person here, Daniel J. Borson, is talking to a media group, the Associated Press. So how do you make a majority feel that it is a minority, feel that it is under threat? What you do, of course, is you use the news. You magnify issues. And it doesn't require a lot. You just pick 10 issues and 10 little news articles about these issues, and you talk about them, and you bring them up, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and on a national level, if you want to find some black kid being shot by a cop, you can find that every week. If you want to find some place where they are arguing about rules for transgender folk in entering the tournament, you can find that every week. Why? Because the United States is a very big country. We have hundreds of millions of people. Every issue you talk about is going to show up at some point, right? You can go on about gay kids have a much higher rate of suicide. And yeah, that's true. But that doesn't mean that, every single gay kid is at risk for suicide. It means that across the average, they are. And it means that certain situations, in certain living situations or certain parts of the country, that you want to focus on these and look at these and figure out, okay, how big is the issue? How much, what do we have to do about this? But the issue might not be the same on the other side of the country, right? Or the issue might be lesser or bigger or smaller, or there's another issue that is actually the important one, or gay kids have high rates of suicide, but it's for a certain reason here and a different reason here and another reason here. And you can, of course, all put that together. But is that the most effective way? Isn't that the most effective way to have a discussion, to exchange facts, to move the dial bit by bit, to shift the system? Because the other option, of course, is always, no, break it all. We need to take the dial from 0 to 100. We need to shift it from north to south. The way we do things, the way we live and breathe and believe, is totally wrong. We gotta fix it. And what do you do in that case? Well, you were dissenting. You were saying, I deny that there is a discussion even to be had. I deny that left or right have a valid viewpoint. And you start seeing the other side as the enemy, and you start seeing yourself as the persecuted minority, or just the minority under threat, even if you are the majority, because what do you see on the news? What do you hear about? What's the topic of discussion? Again and again, it's someone disagrees. And he says here, there is an increasing tendency also to confuse disagreement with dissent. Because that can also happen with a certain viewpoint. If the viewpoint is too hard and harsh, and you don't want to splinter the political group you have, so you have to police it. This is not an acceptable topic of conversation. These are the tenets of the religious or political view that you must have. And the more variation you allow, the more variation will happen. If you have an organization of 5 people, they can generally agree on what the mission statement for the group. Double that to 10 people, or 100 people, or 1,000 people, or 10,000 people. How do you get 10,000 people to agree on a mission statement for a group? It can be difficult. You have to start organizing them, right? You have to say, everyone submit their ideas into a poll, and the and then we'll vote on them. And the top 3 or 5 poll ideas we'll put those to a runoff. And we'll vote on those, or submit all your ideas to a committee, which then decides on the ones they think are acceptable, and then we'll vote on those, and the top 2 go to a runoff and whatnot, right? You have to have an organization. Someone has to decide. Someone has to what to do. Someone has to collect information. Someone has to make the announcement. Someone has to, be the Discord moderator and actually moderate and do things. Because if you allow too much discussion, you never get anywhere. Right? If every one of those 10,000 people can stop the conversation forever by bringing up their issue or their problem, or just standing there and filibustering the issue again and again and again, then you'll never get anywhere. Right? It's like asking, why do we form political parties? We form political parties because that's how you get stuff done. You form smaller groups and then you police those groups. This is the Democratic line. You have to have a party vote. This is the Republican line. You have to have a party vote. And if you vote against, sometimes you're released to voting your conscience, but a lot of times it's, we came to an agreement. The power brokers of the party, of the group, came to an agreement about this idea or this idea. We horse traded with members of this committee. And because it's effective. Because if you had 150 people arguing their idea and all trying to get out of it, you'd never get anywhere. So people learn how to connect to each other, learn how to limit their discussion. We only have a certain amount of time, so we'll use Robert's Rules of Order. Or you can tell me the discussions, but we're going to have these 3 people are going to be the ones who decide, who take the tenor of the room. And make a decision. And it's all on them. These are the majority whip and the minority whip and whatnot. And their job is this. And this is the Senate leader and whatnot. This is the chairman of this committee who decides when the vote is called. Sort of issues like that. So in order to be effective, you have to police yourself somewhat. But then you can take that to an extreme. Any dissent means you get cast out. And if you disagree with the leader in any way, then you must be against the entire party, because everything comes to a point. And this happens, of course, when the basis of a system is too narrow. You want to, if you're going to make a system, you want a system which is, narrow to a certain extent, because you can move it, you can shift it side to side, you can do something with it. If the base is too broad, then it's not a very tall base, it's not a very strong base, it's very difficult to move. Right? Have you ever tried to get 150 million people all moving in the same direction? You gotta just ignore some of them, right? You gotta try to get them in one track. You gotta try to have them follow one idea. Although one is probably a bit of a problem, right? One idea is very simple, very narrow. One idea can be controlled by a single person. I mean, you look at Germany, Nazi Germany, and there's a reason that the Jewish problem, quote unquote, was so important, because it became a fulcrum. This is the major issue. We must fix it. Now, this is why I should get all the power, because these people are so dangerous. Is exactly what Hitler would go for. Or listen to me and I will make Germany great again. Right? You condense it all down to one idea. This is powerful. You have something like, we want to make gay marriage legal, right? And if you all run on that idea, then it's a whole lot more effective than if you go like, well, gay marriage is the ideal, but we can also agree with committed partnerships. We could also agree with just like some tax laws that are exactly the same as marriage. We don't call it marriage. Any one of these three ideas is great. That's not going to be as effective because you aren't aiming at one direction, one idea. It's like, we want to change taxes, but we have to compromise with all these other people. Well, then too much compromise leads to extremely minute changes, extremely small changes. It leads to it being very difficult to move in a direction. So you focus. But if you focus too much, then all of a sudden you're arguing. All of a sudden, something like abortion becomes the cornerstone issue, right? People vote Democrat or Republican, at least to an extent, based only on abortion. There are people, as far as I know, who vote Republican or Democrat based entirely, completely on their ideas about abortion. Right? And they don't care about it's for them. What is important is not the economy, is not the rights, is not the tariffs, it is not Social Security, is not taxes, is not the army, is not foreign affairs, is not whether the police are or not being used. It's not if there's money in the community. It's abortion. And this is a dangerous spot to have, right? Because then you can use that to do anything. I'm for X, Y, and Z and against abortion. And there's a percentage of the community who would just say, okay, well, that's it. And they don't care about X, Y, Z. So X, Y, Z can be anything. I'm for giving myself a $10 million raise. I'm for corruption. I'm for religion in society. I'm for raising taxes. I'm for this group or that group. I'm for war. I'm against war. And if people don't care because you're voting yes or no based on the abortion issue, then nothing else becomes important, right? So if people are voting for Hitler because they hate Jews, and they're not paying attention to whatever else he does, or people are following Hirohito because he's the emperor, we'll listen to that one voice, that one idea, or people are in Thailand. The king has always been very important. So I'm a royalist. Whatever the king says goes, and they don't really care about anything else. If you are in Ireland during the Troubles, and you're like, I'm for Irish independence, and I don't care what we have to do to get it, and I don't care exactly how it happens. I don't really know what's going on, but I'm against the English, and I'm with this group, and I'll always support the rebels no matter what. Or you're in Scotland in the 1400s, William Wallace era, going, I'm against the English no matter what, and it doesn't, like, the English could come in with bucket loads of gold and piles of papers saying we'll give you all these rights and whatnot, but you're still gonna, William Wallace is still gonna stand there and go, no, we don't want all your money, right? This is the issue of all sorts of colonial places, right? Europeans or the Chinese and the Russian come and say, we'll give you, or the Americans, right, come in, we'll say, we'll give you money, we'll give you troops, we'll give you support, but you got to do this for us. And it's a decision to make, right? Do I accept the largesse, or do I decline it simply because they're trying to control me? How important do I judge all the little issues? Too many issues and you can't do anything. Too few issues and you can be pushed around on that issue. You can be spun like a top. With someone who comes up with just the right words because they're for this point, or they promise, or it's all about the economy, baby, right? And they promise to fix the economy. And I don't really understand that much about the economy. I don't really know what's good or bad. All I know is this guy, he stands up and he says, I'm going to fix the economy. And the other person running against him is like, well, the economy is very complicated. I want to have this issue and this issue. And I want discussions with this. You're like, I just want to fix the bloody economy. I'm for this guy, because that's all you care about. This is the problem of a like a two-party system is both of them, you end up having a system which is very static, doesn't move very much. It can be difficult. It can end up being very difficult for one party to actually get, president in both houses of Congress and also be effective. They'll end up being effective about certain things, like the Republicans pass a lot of rules about like lowering taxes because they all agree on that, but other issues become more complicated. And you have some groups who can stand there and, well, if we do nothing, and he pointed this out earlier with the dissenters in Vietnam. All you have to do is take over the system. All you have to do is sit in Congress and not vote on something. All you have to do is sit in the university office and not do anything, so that the workers can't get to their desks. Right? All you have to do is not pay somebody. And the world moves on. The system will shut down by itself because you aren't actively supporting it. So this is something that happened, at least as I understand it, in Obama's terms, where at one point you just had like the Republicans voting against anything, stopping all major legislation from getting through. And it's like, well, Obama's for that, so we're against it, flat out. There was a joke skit I saw a few days ago, which is like this. It's like it was Obama in a room with a bunch of Republican leaders, and he's like, "Well, I'm for this," and they immediately vote the opposite. So he's trying to trick them into voting for what he agrees with by saying that, I'm for lowering taxes, and the knee-jerk response of the red side is, "No, that's a bad idea. What you said is a bad idea." So he's like, "All right, so you're for high taxes," and the Republicans are like, "I don't wait." Well, I'm like, and this is, I think, an issue. Like, what happens with, Donald Trump when he comes out and says something that the Democrats agree is a good idea, right? How are they going to respond? Do they say, nothing this guy says, nothing the Republicans say is ever a good idea, or do they say, "Oh, we'll support that"? But you can. But then you have sort of an issue, right? Say you have two political parties, and one side is like, "Oh, we dislike everything you do, but we'll support this one idea." Well, you pass a law, right? And you make it a big law. And in that big law, you put many, many different things. And all of a sudden, it's, okay, so if you want to vote for this one issue that you are in agreement with, then you have to vote for it in this bill. And this bill contains a whole lot of other things you disagree with. So the one side doesn't vote for the bill, and the side who put up the bill says, "Oh, look, they are against you. They disagree with you. They don't like what's happening. We offered them a deal. They voted against this issue, and it was in the bill, and I can show you they voted against this." And you just don't mention everything else that was in the bill. Meanwhile, your opponents are stuck there going, "Okay, yeah, I know I voted down, defense spending, or I know I voted down putting in a new hospital in the area, but I did that because it was a poison pill law, and there were all these other things going on." And it's much easier to be on the offense than the defense in that situation. It's much easier to attack the person than to explain that, no, it's a complicated, and I was for this, but they include other things. So I know it looks like I voted against it, but I was actually voting against all these other things. Like, you're trying to shift the conversation. Meanwhile, your enemy just has to say, "No, he against." So as you try to understand this, what goes on? What happens? Okay, it says, in many circles, to be an outspoken conformist, that is to say that the prevailing ways of the community are not evil, requires more courage than to run with the dissenting pack. And it also says here, professional dissenters do not and cannot seek to assimilate their program or ideals into American culture. Their main object is to preserve their separate identity as a dissenting minority. So he's writing in 1967, and he has what I would imagine is a very clear view of the American minority and the American majority. But as we enter an era where even the majority defending itself takes on a minority identity, you have this issue, dissent for dissent's sake. We have a whole group of magazines these days dedicated not to this or that particular program or social reform, nor this or that social philosophy, but simply to dissent. And you don't have to dissent in the sense that what the popular people are doing is bad. What this minority is doing is bad. You can dissent in the sense that everyone who is not with us is against us. You can dissent in the way that, look at all these people who think our ideas are terrible and bad. Look at all these people who do not want America to become a shining place in the hill. Or look at all these people who want to tear down the shining city on the hill. You can dissent by disagreeing with what someone is doing, or you can dissent by simply saying they aren't doing it right. And they aren't doing it right. And they aren't doing it right. And somehow they never, they, quote unquote, never seem to do it right. You read in the news and again and again and again, and it doesn't matter who's in charge, they never do it right. And when your people get in charge, they still can't do it right. But it's not their fault, because the other people are stopping you. And that's a mental gymnastic which is difficult to understand to an extent, right? There was some bit on YouTube I saw where it was like, the Republicans are like, we aren't in charge of the country, and then they the YouTuber shows a map of, okay, here's where you have governors, and here's where you control both parties, and you also have the presidency and both houses, and then here's a congressman saying you aren't in charge. The deep state is stopping us. I'm like, you are the deep state. It can be the same for the Democrats at one point. There was all this issue about, what is it? Like the abortion issue, right? You could have passed law. You think, for 30 years, you would have, if it was such an important issue that that a political identity relied upon it. There are millions of people in the country who vote simply based completely on that issue. That at one point, when you had both houses in the presidency, you would have voted to put it in the law, but you didn't, because it was a whole lot more useful to use it as a dissenting issue. It was a whole lot more useful not to have that fight because the Supreme Court protected it. And it turns out that what can be done by one court can be undone by another court. You have, like, the border, the southern border. You hear for years and years and years about the southern border, and somehow the politicians never get around to fixing it. You hear for years and years and years about the debt and the problem with China and the insolvency of Social Security, and somehow it never really gets fixed, because it's very, very useful as a political mechanism. If you fix the problem, what happens next? Well, you got to pick a new fight. You got to have a new power base. You got to argue over something else. Conversely, you can fix the problem, and then the other side says, no, you haven't fixed the problem. No, here's an example of it failing here and failing here and failing there. And, the government wants to make healthcare nationwide. The government wants to put out welfare, and here's some welfare queen with 12 kids. And here's the government is giving out business loans, and here's a bunch of business loans that were forgiven. The government is giving out this money. Well, here's a bunch of fraud. Because in a big enough country with big enough issues, you can always find one of these issues going on. There's always going to be a crack. And you find that crack and you bring it up and up and up. Eventually, it gets big enough that what happens? Right? It breaks the system, or the small issue becomes huge, right? Like, what's with the rise in school shootings, in mass gun murders? Like, what's going on here? And part of it is, as far as I understand, that it gets talked about in the news. You get copycats. Oh, they went out blazing. They went out guns blazing. I'm gonna go out guns blazing. This is an effective answer to what I do. And you have all, talks about, we should add more police or to the schools, or we need to, the schools around me, they put up iron bars, added fences where they didn't need fences for 60 years around the school, and now they do, apparently. We should give the teachers guns, or we should change gun laws so you have background checks on these people, or more control, or make it easier for the police to take guns away from those who have obvious mental issues. Make parents liable if their kids happen to kill a bunch of folk. Criminally liable because daddy gave him the gun and he went on and killed a bunch of people with it. So obviously you messed up somewhere. And we all go back and forth and back and forth, and I think there's discussions to be had about issues like that. There's arguments on one side or another about what to do and what the solutions are and which ones are acceptable and how we manage these solutions. But there's also statements that are like, we cannot stop, we have to outlaw all guns. Or the liberals are trying to take all our guns, and we can't give them an inch. When we see it in other countries, like, in Israel and Palestine, right? We can't give the Palestinians an inch, or they use it to destroy us. Or, the Israelis can't be trusted an inch because they always, lie, or whatever the ruling is. When the other side is so untrusted, and each side sees themselves as the small minority that's under threat. And, if the Palestinians are going, oh, Israel is attacking us and the rest of the world doesn't give a damn. If there is Israeli view, you're standing there going, the Palestinians want to destroy us, and so does all the Middle East, and the entire world is against us, and we gotta, except for our few little friends in the United States. That's the story you tell yourself. It's clearer when it's a foreign country, right? It's clearer when you know some of the history, when you read the books. It's not quite so obvious in your own country, in your own state, in your own media, because we're used to it. I turn on the news, I can look at, YouTube, and it recommends me viewpoints, which are, like, the ones I listen to. That they're generally leftist-leaning YouTubers or YouTube lawyers or something like this. And then I notice that sometimes I have X installed on my phone. But I signed up with a new account, and it started recommending me, right-wing stuff. And I get news articles like, the U.S. government said this, Donald Trump said that. And I'm seeing, okay, so my news on one platform is totally different from my news on another platform. So, am I the minority? Am I the majority? Am I the person in between? How do I know? How do I know the timber of, or the timber? How do I know the temper of the nation? How do I know what other people believe and think? Because what can happen is if you have a bunch of minorities, and they all see themselves as the minority, And people can be allies. You can have allies, but they aren't really for you. Or they're good allies and bad allies, or they're well-meaning allies but misunderstanding allies. But you see yourself as persecuted or under attack. Right or left, red or blue, conservative or liberal, and whatnot. And you're like, today we have the echo chambers, right? The people you talk to, the social media you are involved with, the news you see, it tends to reinforce itself. Your feed reinforces itself with a viewpoint because you like that viewpoint. And it keeps telling you, and you start to believe the world is this way. And then you hear something, or somebody says something, or you have a dinner table conversation, and a view is espoused with you which you don't understand, or a view is espoused which you have been told is evil and wrong, or a view is espoused which you learned represents an ignorant person, or you learned represents a racist person. And you have a story in your head about what that means and who they are, and they can't be trusted. They could be trusted. If they aren't, and what comes from that is a viewpoint which enjoys dissent, right? Because dissent allows you to say, I am me. I am part of a group, and we are together. And my group wouldn't betray me as long as I espouse these ideals. Or it could be, and I feel safe in the group. It doesn't. You don't have to feel safe in the group because the group supports you. It can just be like, hey, I feel safe in the group because I espouse an identity. And if I do this if I espouse this identity, then anyone who also espouses that identity is like me. I'm like them. We're all one group. And I'm not alone. And if you see yourself as a minority, then you go, oh my gosh, I am not alone. If you see yourself as threatened, if you see yourself as odd, if you one day see news which is too right-wing or too left-wing for you, and or if you see news which is telling you that the world, that the people are left-wing or right-wing or Republican or Democrat or sexist or racist or going to hate your particular culture or way of life or religion, then you start to become worried, start to become afraid. And then you recognize, oh, there's a minority that's like me, that's with me, that I don't need to be afraid of. The minorities have an interest in holding their identity close. Majorities are okay with, so a healthy majority is okay with discussion, is okay with differing points of view, because they don't feel threatened. And I'm calling these a majority and minority viewpoint because that's what he calls them in this book. Sorry, in this speech, because he's speaking in 1967. And I think when he says minorities, he's thinking about the blacks and the hippies and then the feminists and whatnot. But I don't know that entirely. And today, when I think of the minorities, I'm using words like blacks and the feminists and the poor and whatnot, but I'm using that because I've heard those words used over time. Because the minority identity is supposed to be these groups, and when you get down to it, like the minority identity of women, what minority identity of women? You get 50% of the country, right? And so within womankind, or within mankind, mankind, and in the wavy space in between them, you have identities which which fragment, are complex, are multidimensional. And a lot of intersections of different identities and ideas and viewpoints and needs and lifetimes and their work, their job, their family, their hopes, their dreams, their despairs, their understanding of history, their philosophy. So when you hear that, when you see minorities, is it we see like, okay, well, they're a minority, and I identify them as a minority, so those who are against them are the majority. But it can be more complicated than that, right? Like with the gay marriage issue, which was illegal not that long ago in the United States. I think something that was surprising is the Supreme Court recognized gay marriage, and most of the country just sort of went along with it. Even in those states where it hadn't been passed yet, I think a great deal. There wasn't a huge. There are still people out there who disagree with, or who refuse to make cakes, or refuse to do pass sign marriage licenses and whatnot. But to a great extent, it is an issue which passed without a horrible lot of comment, or at least it did in my experience, in the place where I live, and the people I met, and whatnot. When I was in high school, there was one guy that we were pretty sure was gay, and there were others who came out later as gay. And some of them would like post stuff on Facebook in 2014 or whatnot. I didn't feel comfortable coming out then, but I feel comfortable now. And in just a few short years, the country changes around it. Sees it not as an issue. And that's my experience with the people I've met and talked to and heard about. And this isn't to say that the issue has gone away. This isn't to say that there aren't still people who dislike the very idea of gays. But representation is more common in media. It is less of a hot button issue. Most people, even older folk I know who are uncomfortable with it, are not uncomfortable with it to the extent that they won't talk to a gay person, or they're afraid of a gay person, right? Like you hear about the AIDS epidemic and how people, there are movies out there about folk who are like, oh my gosh, you're gay, and they like back away because they think you're dangerous and infective. And now I don't see or hear that in my experience, at least. Yet if I turn on the news, I hear a great deal of troubles about this. And I go, which is it? How do I understand the nation when the news is seemingly always showing the problems, always harping about dissent, always explaining how bad and terrible things are, or how dangerous this administration is? And I go, in my daily life, how does this affect me? What does this change? Eventually, of course, it will. Eventually I'll see ICE grab someone I know on the streets, or I'll have to buy a GPU when the tariff has gone up 100%. And that's when all of a sudden I realize, oh, maybe something is happening. Maybe something is changing. Because I didn't just read about it in the news, which I've grown to distrust. Instead, it affects me directly. And what do you do then? Do you engage in discussion, or do you engage in dissent? When you see someone who disagrees with you, when you feel that the nation is under less danger than someone else says it is, or under more danger, how do you face that? He says, is it possible at the same time to find new ways of interesting people in disagreement in specific items and problems and programs and specific evils? When I talk about the green energy transition and the oil economy. It's very simple and easy to end up having a discussion where green energy is good, oil is bad, or the green energy people are threatening our jobs, so they're bad. And how do you avoid that? Like as a person, but also as I'm talking on YouTube here, right? As someone who tries to have discussions with people from different cultures and ideas, who is reading books by some white guy in 1967. Reading speeches by some white guy in 1967, and someone who disagrees with the slavery as a cause for the Civil War, and some Secretary Rumsfeld, some Secretary of Defense. I'm reading, read a book on white frailty, and read a book on the economy and taxes, and I'm going, okay, I disagree with some of these ideas. I agree with some of these ideas, and how do I explain that? I'm not doing this in a very concise manner. I'm spending hours, literally hours, just rambling on and on and on about this idea and that idea and how it relates here and how it relates there, and my political views come out, and my moral views come out, and then I say. And then I try to say I'm for this and against this, but also give a voice to each side, not because I think one side is totally right or totally wrong, but because if you completely ignore one side of the discussion, then you can't have a discussion. So how do you do that? Because eventually, you have a claim, counterclaim, and it's happened in almost any discussion, right? Eventually you get to a point where you just agree to disagree. So what do you do then? You can give up. You can both stand where you are, say this is right, this is wrong, and I will not move an inch. This is smart, you're stupid, and I will not move an inch. This is anti-American, that is anti-American. This is pro-American. No, you're being anti-American. And I will not move an inch on this subject and this idea. And it's so obvious to anyone with a brain. Or I feel threatened and I need to do something about this. But anytime I try to argue about the sanctity of religion, I feel like I'm being attacked, or I feel like I'm being told that I'm going to be attacked, or I feel like everyone is telling me that everyone is actually against me and attacking me. And, part of the issue of the news, I think, of hearing things, is he talks about the opinion. Everyone has to have an opinion. And what he means by this is the view that if you aren't for us, you're against us. Well, you listen to people, and a lot of people just want to, live their lives. I think it's that silent majority that we all sort of view differently. What is this silent majority? Does it even exist? And because it's silent, how do you know what it's for or against? How do you know to move it in a certain way? How do you know, how the next vote will turn out? A third of Americans in this country don't vote. Why is that? There's massive numbers of people in this country who vote for one party or the other party, and it's all about that. And why is that? What is the view here? Are we actually static, or do we just think we're static? Nobody thought Donald Trump could win an election, but he ended up doing so, and changing the party and the speech of our entire political system in the process, for good and bad. Okay, so he says here, is it possible for our newspapers, without becoming Pollyannas or chauvinists or super patriots or good humor salesmen, to find new ways of expressing and affirming, dramatizing and illuminating what people agree upon? It's easy to say what people disagree about, but how do you begin to say what agreement is? How do you begin to get the tenure of the nation? You have opinion polls, 70% of people are in favor of this, 80% of people are in favor of this, and yet it doesn't seem to get passed as laws. So of what use are opinion polls? 80% of people say we need to deal with the budget as a problem, we need to deal with it, and we never do. Because that's what the opinion polls say people care about, but really they don't. Because it hasn't affected their daily lives. They have an opinion on it, but why do they really vote one side or the other? It's some other hot button issue. And yet I could say the same about almost anything, right? The budget, abortion, defense, cultural issues, the green energy, education. You can put out disagreements, we can have opinion polls, and then you have opinion polls that say we agree with everyone, everyone agrees about this and nothing gets done. And why is that? Because we all see ourselves as minorities. Where is the majority, right? Like, how do you become part of the majority? How do you become yourself and yet also an American? This is what he's warning about here. We become a Democrat or a Republican. We become a liberal or a green. We become someone who is for civil rights or against civil rights. We become someone who is for illegals or against illegals. We become someone who is for free education or against free education. We have to hold an opinion on everything, and if we don't hold an opinion on it, then we stay quiet about it. We stay silent. And partly what I'm trying to do in this effort is to, by accepting the possibility that I could be wrong, still have the courage to spout an opinion. The many things which I do not understand, there are many ideas I don't really know why I hold them. There are views which I espouse and then 10 minutes later I disavow them. Why is that? What's going on? How do I check myself? How do I even know what I myself disagree upon? I start talking. I talk and I talk and I talk, and I try not to bind myself to one idea or one view too tightly, even though I have my ideas and my views. I try to allow space for discussion, and if it's not discussion with people, because I have my own issues, I at least have a discussion with a book, with a speech, with an idea, with myself. And in this way, in the violent confrontation, which is more like a wrestling match than a sword fight, I'm not trying to kill myself or my ideas or my beliefs. I'm trying to strengthen them, trying to work out a bit. And this results in muscles hurting. This results in my a headache or my tongue, my throat. This results in me sometimes saying things and then trying to backtrack, trying to fix what I'm saying because it didn't really, that could be misinterpreted in a different way, or it's not exactly what I wanted to say, or I'm trying to find the words, but I don't know them. And how do you find the words? You either read them somewhere else or you practice. You practice speech and ideas. And I repeat myself a lot, right? Because I'm trying to find a new way of expressing and affirming, dramatizing, and illuminating my viewpoints. And it's not a great start, right? Like I'm trying to say I am. How do I be me but not a minority, right? How do I be me and yet not feel threatened by every side? How do I be me and yet hold pride in my identity? It's like the black white distinction. All of a sudden people find white pride. I'm like, it pops up in response to something. All of a sudden people find that their sexual identity is super important to them, because people keep telling them it is. And for some people, that's true. It's them. That's their lives. For others, it is a side point. you could talk about anything, right? Green energy, plastic in the water, microplastics, a war overseas, the whatever budget on whatever. It's like there's no answer exactly. There's no silver bullet. He says, this is your challenge. The future of American society, no small measure, depends on whether and how you answer it. So maybe this is a bit of an experiment. If I stand up and I talk for hours and hours about my ideas, how are those ideas received? What discussion is possible? What will someone point out that I didn't even think about? What one of my words will be, or sentences will be taken out of context and used to shroud what I think instead of reveal it. And if I can understand that, then I can go through and change my words next time, trying to speak more clearly and explain things better, or I can even learn, okay, maybe I espoused a racist or a sexist view here, and let me understand what happened, why that is, and how to fix it, but without being so caught up in either the feeling that I'm under attack for even daring to have an idea, or that I have to agree with somebody, right? That's something, if you see yourself as the minority, this minority viewpoint that Daniel J. Borson is talking about, I think what can happen is you think of yourself as alone, as scared, as needing help, as being in danger, because you're a small minority and you're not part of the majority, you're not part of the main view, and you have to be a part of something, right? If you want to be safe, you need a group, you need a family, you need an identity. But what if you're kind of like me and you're working on that identity, right? Instead of cleaving, you can cleave tightly to somebody or to some viewpoint. You can say, I am gay, or I am straight, or I am white, or I am black, and that's what I am, and it defines me, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat, or I'm for this president, or I'm against this president, and that is how I consider all my political activity. But I think what happens with most people is you attend a protest, for example, and you're against a president, or you're for a president or an idea. Then you go back to your normal life, and it's a part of you. Now, the more that issue begins to affect you, the more you are brought up, the more you care. But sometimes you don't know how much you care until it happens, right? Until something does affect you, until a member of your family or your neighbor is pulled out on the street by mass figures you don't even know, who don't identify themselves, and somebody throws you to the ground and demands to see your identification. Then all of a sudden you realize how much you care and how much you should care, but you didn't before. Why is that? Because someone had a interaction with you. Because you realize that there are other people in the world who see it differently than you, who are individuals that experience the world in a separate way, who are members of groups that disagree with who you are and how you see the world and what right and wrong, good and bad is. And it can be worrisome and troublesome to get involved in that. Right? You go home, you have dinner, you speak angrily about it, and then you go to work and you forget about it. Or maybe you get so involved in the movement, and all of a sudden you're posting online all the time. You're talking with your friends. You're attending a demonstration in the quad at your college. These sorts of things. Like it's a matter of balancing. So what I want to do at least is not have a solid identity, right? It is not to say that I am part of this group or that group, and therefore I must understand myself through the lens of this group. I must understand the world through the lens of that group. who am I as an individual? And can I see myself as an individual and yet still hold a sort of my majority viewpoint? By this, I mean, can I have my own personal, political, economic, social identity and yet feel that I am an American? Right? Feel that I am a human being, feel that I am a member of the world, the species, or the biosphere, and that I can express my identity by being myself and not being some fact or name that someone gives me. What do I call myself? How do I find out who I am? Do I have the courage to speak and be misunderstood, and thereby learn what I think I should?